Horror sequels have a habit of going completely off the deep end. Sometimes they reinvent the formula, other times they dive headfirst into chaos. And we wouldn't have it any other way. From haunted houses to cursed camps, demonic priests to telekinetic killers, the late-night horror aisles of the VHS era were overflowing with sequels that pushed every limit imaginable. Tonight, we're diving back into the madness with 10 follow-ups that took wild creative swings, broke their own rules, and somehow became unforgettable cult favorites in the process. The Gate 2, Trespassers, 1990. Trespassers is one of those rare horror sequels that dares to go smaller and stranger instead of bigger and louder. Released at the dawn of the 90s, it continues the story from the original cult favorite but shifts the focus inward, exploring the fallout of the first film's events and the lasting temptation of forbidden power. It's darker, moodier, and surprisingly emotional, trading chaos for melancholy as it follows a kid who never quite escaped the shadow of what he unleashed. The story centers on Terry, the awkward, grieving friend from the first film, who now lives a lonely, unstable life. Still haunted by the creatures he helped summon years earlier, he decides to reopen the portal to make things right, or maybe just to get a second chance at controlling his fate. But the moment he tries to bend those demonic forces to his will, things spiral again, and the familiar small-town setting becomes a quiet battleground between guilt, grief, and temptation. Director Tibor Takacs returns with a film that feels like a darker reflection of the first. Gone is the sense of wonder. In its place is something more tragic, a cautionary tale about obsession and consequences, wrapped in practical effects and stop-motion creatures that retain their handmade charm. The Gate 2 might not have the energy of its predecessor, but it has a haunting sincerity that sticks with you. It's a sequel about mistakes that can't be undone, and about the dangerous hope that maybe, somehow, you can make peace with what you've opened. The Fly 2, 1989. The Fly 2 picks up where David Cronenberg's remake left off, not by trying to outmatch its predecessor's brilliance, but by expanding its tragic universe through a new generation. Directed by Chris Wallace, who handled the creature effects for the first film, this sequel trades the original's emotional intimacy for a more tragic coming-of-age story, set inside a cold corporate world. It's both a continuation and a mutation, evolving the story's science fiction horror into something that feels uniquely late 80s. The film centers on Martin Brundle, the son of Seth Brundle, who inherits his father's intelligence and his genetic curse. Raised under the watchful eye of a powerful tech conglomerate, Martin grows up at an accelerated rate, caught between scientific ambition and the dark legacy embedded in his DNA. As his condition worsens, his relationship with a young lab worker becomes the only human element in a world otherwise built on manipulation and greed. What makes The Fly 2 effective is its shift in perspective. It's less about transformation as terror, and more about transformation as destiny. The slow realization that you can't escape what's inside you. Wallace fills the film with grim industrial settings, pulsing electronics, and some of the most grotesque practical effects of the era. While it lacks the existential poetry of Cronenberg's version, The Fly 2 succeeds on its own terms, as a dark, heartbreaking sequel that mixes tragedy and monster horror into one unforgettable finale. It's a creature feature with a conscience, reminding us that sometimes the experiment doesn't just go wrong, it's doomed from the start. Sleepaway Camp 2, Unhappy Campers, 1988. Few sequels reinvent their source material quite like Sleepaway Camp 2, Unhappy Campers, ditching the grim tone of the original. This follow-up transforms the series into a blood-soaked black comedy, a slasher that's equal parts self-aware and gleefully deranged. It's the rare horror sequel that feels completely in on the joke, poking fun at genre cliches while still delivering the goods for anyone who came for the kills. This time, the story follows Angela Baker, now fully reformed, or so she claims, working as a counselor at a summer camp packed with rowdy teenagers. But Angela's idea of good behavior involves a body count, and soon she's turning her moral lessons into creative executions. Pamela Springsteen, sister of Bruce, plays Angela with a perfect mix of cheerfulness and menace, giving the film a tone that's both campy and unnervingly sincere. Director Michael A. Simpson leans into the absurdity, filling the movie with sly references to Friday the 13th, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and other horror staples. The humor never undercuts the slasher energy. Instead, it sharpens it, making the film feel like a knowing wink to horror fans who grew up on late-night marathons and worn rental tapes. Unhappy Camper stands out because it never tries to replicate the shock of the first film. Instead, it finds its own identity, playful, violent, and endlessly quotable. It's the kind of cult sequel that thrives on personality, proving that sometimes the smartest way to follow a classic is to flip the tone entirely and have a little fun doing it. Amityville 2: The Possession, 1982. Before the Amityville series turned into an endless run of haunted object spin-offs, The Possession delivered something genuinely unsettling. Rather than continuing the story of the first film, it dives backward, a prequel that explores what happened in the house before the Lutz family ever moved in. It's a grim, atmospheric film that mixes supernatural horror with a slow, suffocating descent into madness. The story follows the Montelli family, newcomers to the infamous house on Ocean Avenue. Strange voices echo through the halls, objects move on their own, and the tension between family members grows more violent by the day. Director Damiano Damiani takes his time building dread, leaning on heavy shadows, oppressive silence, and a sense that something ancient and evil has already claimed the place. What makes Amityville 2 so effective is how raw and uncomfortable it feels. It trades jump scares for an overwhelming sense of corruption, a haunting that feels psychological as much as spiritual. Burt Young's volatile performance gives the film a cruel edge, while the house itself feels alive, feeding on everything that happens inside. It's not just another haunted house sequel. It's a grim reimagining that outshines the original in atmosphere and intensity. The movie captures that perfect early 80s horror mood, grounded, relentless, and genuinely disturbing in a way that still lingers long after the credits roll. Evil Dead 2, 1987. Sam Raimi's Evil Dead 2 is one of the rare sequels that completely reinvents the original, while staying true to its chaotic spirit. Instead of simply continuing the first film's story, Raimi uses the setup as a springboard for something far more inventive, a delirious mix of horror, comedy, and raw creativity that feels like it's sprinting from start to finish. Ash Williams returns to the infamous cabin, but this time the nightmare is even more unhinged. Demonic forces twist reality itself, turning the film into a non-stop barrage of flying cameras, splattering blood, and cartoonish violence. Bruce Campbell throws himself into the role with wild physicality, selling every scream, grimace, and one-liner with the energy of a man possessed. What makes Evil Dead 2 stand out isn't just its blend of tones, but how confident it feels in its madness. Raimi embraces low-budget ingenuity and turns it into a style. Every shot, every gag, every grotesque effect becomes part of the movie's rhythm. It's relentless, funny, and genuinely unsettling all at once. More than a sequel, Evil Dead 2 became a benchmark for creative horror filmmaking, proof that a director's imagination could turn even the simplest premise into something unforgettable. It didn't just expand a cult classic. It redefined how wild and expressive horror could be when rules went out the window. Pumpkinhead 2: Blood Wings, 1993. Pumpkinhead 2 shouldn't work as well as it does. A lower-budget continuation that manages to carry forward the mythic atmosphere of the original while creating its own twisted identity. Gone is Lance Henriksen's tragic revenge arc, but in its place comes a different kind of Southern Gothic horror, one that leans into small-town legends, backwoods secrets, and moral decay hiding under the surface. The film follows a group of reckless teenagers who stumble onto an old ritual and accidentally resurrect the creature known as Pumpkinhead, this time tied to the vengeful spirit of a wronged outcast named Tommy. What begins as a prank quickly spirals into something darker, as the demon's return unearths the sins of the town and the violence people thought they'd buried decades earlier. Director Jeff Burr gives Blood Wings a moody, fog-soaked tone that feels right at home in the early direct-to-video era. The creature effects remain impressive, the kills are inventive, and there's a tragic undercurrent running through it all that keeps it from feeling disposable. It may not have the emotional depth of the first film, but Pumpkinhead 2 succeeds by expanding the mythology and giving the monster a strange, sorrowful edge. It's part rural ghost story, part creature feature. The kind of late-night horror sequel that might not have had a wide release, but stayed burned into the memories of anyone who stumbled across it after dark. The Exorcist 3, 1990. The Exorcist 3 is one of the most surprising sequels in horror history, a film that ignores the excess of Exorcist 2, and instead returns to the psychological dread and theological weight of the original, but through an entirely new lens. Written and directed by William Peter Blatty, the author of The Exorcist, this entry trades spectacle for atmosphere, crafting a slow, unnerving descent into faith, doubt, and evil that feels more like a detective story than a possession film. The story follows Lieutenant Kinderman, reprised by George C. Scott, as he investigates a string of brutal murders linked to a killer long thought dead, and to events that should be impossible. As his search leads him back to a psychiatric ward, the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural begin to collapse, culminating in one of the most haunting third acts of the decade. Blatty builds his horror through dialogue, silence, and dread instead of cheap scares. The film's pacing is deliberate, almost meditative, allowing every unsettling moment to breathe. When it does strike, it hits hard, including one of the most famous jump scares in horror history, executed with masterful precision. The Exorcist 3 isn't just a course correction for the franchise, it's a rare example of a sequel that dares to be introspective. It explores guilt, redemption, and the quiet persistence of evil with a sense of intelligence and restraint that make it as haunting today as it was in 1990. Proof that horror can still unsettle the soul without ever raising its voice. Scanners 2, The New Order, 1991. A full decade after David Cronenberg's original, Scanners 2, The New Order took the franchise in a new direction, expanding its telepathic world while trading the cold paranoia of the first film for a slicker, early 90s sci-fi tone. Set in a world where government agencies have learned about the existence of scanners, the film explores how those psychic abilities might be exploited, corrupted, and turned into weapons of control. The story follows David Kellum, a mild-mannered veterinary student who discovers his powers after stopping a robbery. His abilities draw the attention of a ruthless police commander who envisions an army of scanners enforcing his vision of law and order. What begins as a story about personal discovery quickly turns into a nightmare of manipulation and power. As David is drawn deeper into a system that uses telepaths as tools rather than people. Director Christian Duguay replaces Cronenberg's gritty horror with a more polished, action-tinged style, filled with practical effects, psychic duels, and that unmistakable Canadian genre feel of the early 90s. The scanner battles still deliver the trademark head-popping intensity, but beneath the spectacle is a theme about individuality, corruption, and loss of control. Scanners 2 doesn't try to outdo the original. It expands the universe instead. It's a sequel that embraces its era's identity, bridging psychological horror and science fiction with a glossy, cable-era edge. While often overlooked, it stands as a surprisingly effective continuation that captures both the strangeness and tragedy of being superhuman in a world built to use you. Prom Night 2, Hello Mary Lou, 1987. Prom Night 2 is one of those sequels that barely connects to its predecessor. And that's exactly why it works. Instead of continuing the original's slasher storyline, this one reinvents the series as a slick, supernatural revenge tale with a mischievous streak. Set in the late 80s but haunted by the ghosts of the 50s, it turns a simple prom night setup into a stylish blend of teen melodrama, possession horror, and campy flair. The story centers on Mary Lou Maloney, a rebellious prom queen from 1957 whose tragic death becomes local legend. Decades later, her spirit is unleashed during prom season at the same high school, possessing an unsuspecting student and wreaking havoc on anyone who gets in her way. Director Bruce Pittman fills the movie with surreal dream sequences, fiery visuals, and practical effects that rival much bigger productions of the time. What makes Hello, Mary Lou stand out is its confidence. It's playful but genuinely eerie, leaning into visual flair and gallows humor without ever losing its edge. Lisa Schrage's performance as the vengeful Mary Lou is magnetic, equal parts seductive and terrifying, and the film's high school setting gives it that perfect mix of nostalgia and danger. Over the years, Prom Night 2 has earned its place as one of the best horror sequels of the 80s. Bold, self-aware, and dripping with attitude. It's a reminder that sometimes the best follow-ups are the ones that throw the rulebook out the window and just have fun haunting the halls. Children of the Corn 2, The Final Sacrifice, 1992. Nearly a decade after the original, The Final Sacrifice carried Stephen King's small-town nightmare into the early 90s with a fresh setting and a darker tone. Moving the story from Gatlin to the nearby town of Hemmingford, the film explores what happens when the surviving children are taken in by unsuspecting locals, and the evil presence that fueled their violence begins to spread once again. This time, the story follows a cynical journalist and his teenage son, who arrive to investigate the aftermath of the first massacre. What they find is a community trying to move on, even as the cornfields whisper their next command. The sequel leans into atmosphere, using open farmland and empty rural streets to build a sense of creeping isolation. The children are no longer just killers. They're the devoted servants of something ancient, manipulating adults and outsiders with eerie calm. What makes The Final Sacrifice work is its balance between campy sequel energy and genuine unease. It embraces early 90s horror tropes, practical effects, bold lighting, and that small-town paranoia that defined so many straight-to-video hits, yet still delivers moments that feel surprisingly grim. The Midwest landscapes and ominous religious overtones give it a strange, almost dreamlike quality. While it never reached the cult status of the original, Children of the Corn 2 remains one of the better follow-ups in a long-running series, capturing the uneasy blend of faith, fear, and farmland that made the first story so haunting. These sequels might not have topped the originals, but they definitely earned their place in horror history by daring to go off the rails. Each one captures that fearless creativity that defined the VHS era. Messy, ambitious, and totally unforgettable. If you're into deep-cut horror and late-night rentals, make sure to hit subscribe and check out Part 1 for more wild horror sequels that went completely off the deep end. And remember, always be kind and rewind, because every movie is someone's favorite.